By the time the last bell stopped shaking the air, the village had already learned a new kind of quiet. Not the ordinary hush of winter before dawn, not the workday lull when the mill sleeps. This was a hollow quiet, a bowl, upturned quiet. The track through the houses looked broader now that no carts pressed its edges. Wheel ruts were scabbed with old mud and pale weeds. The door of the weaver's cottage hung crooked on a single strap hinge. The shuttle still threaded where a hand had left it mid-throw. Someone's bread peel leaned against a cold oven dust, softening the curve where flour used to. I carried my father's hammer because it felt impolite to walk through all that unfinished work with empty hands. The head had a small nick you could find by touch. The haft shone smooth, where his palm years ago had made a groove. My name is Ansel. It does not matter how old I am, plague years make a tally stick of you in other ways. Father left in August. Mother followed. I remember the smell of pine pitch boiling hard, and the fists of men who had no breath left to cry, but worked anyway, because someone had to close the boxes. What I don't remember is the last thing she said. The mind privatizes a few coins when the markets fall apart. There were 4 of us who kept meeting by the little pit where we burned off damp wood Margot, whose husband had made barrels with a care that always felt like he was hemming the world. Thomas Lithe and Falstrong, who had mucked stables at the manor, and old Lou, who had somehow outlived 2 winters, and the sickness with nothing but a rope belt and a stubborn fondness for stories. We did not use the word survivors. The word was a shutter that bangs in wind. We preferred smaller, kinder words, kettle stool, plank loaf, things that sat still when named. That first morning, I clicked the gate latch and walked the length of our lane reading a catalogue of absences. A child's hoop lodged under a hedge. A hen's feather trapped in a crack like a bit of frayed parchment. The print of a dog softened by weeks of weather. A bucket on its side, leaking nothing. Each artifact had the weight of a sentence paused at the hinge of a breath. I found the cooper's adze under his bench and put it back where it belonged, because we could not afford mess. We gathered at the market square at noon, as if the sun had wrung us, not the church. The trestles stood like ribs without canvas. On the far side, a stray dog sniffed a pole and made promises to no one. I took a bit of chalk from the old tally board and drew a square on the packed dirt. Inside, I wrote with a hand that had to relearn its letters, "Who needs a roof mended, leave a bough here." It was not a plan so much as a statement of wishes, like a prayer that was sensible enough to carry its own bucket. "Think anyone will read that?" Thomas asked. "People who cannot read can still understand a bowl," said Margot. She set down the wooden mixing bowl she'd carried to keep her hands busy. It looked indecently clean. She smiled at how neat it seemed there in the dust, as if doing a good job of being a bowl. We set a rhythm in the afternoon. One of us fetched water, one split kindling, one looked for doors that would not close. Routine was a way of telling time that did not involve bells. Lou, stooped and sun-haired, took on the role of commentator, as if we were a procession worth announcing. "The thing about a road," he said, poking the mud with his walking stick, "is that it looks deserted until someone declares it useful." He had a talent for saying something simple and making it sound discovered. That evening, Margot coaxed the coals in her hearth, with a breath that sounded almost motherly. She cooked oats thin with water and pinched in a whisper of salt. We used spoons that did not match, which felt daring. Eating is a public act, even in private, and it helps when someone laughs. We did 3 small laughs and 1 large cough. We did not talk about tomorrow as an improvement that is a dangerous superstition. We talked about the signs we would look for smoke from the mason's chimney. A track of 2 small feet along the north fence. A light in the shutter vault of the mill. Signs were a currency you could afford. I would like to say that miracles began then, but miracles don't begin. Their edges overlap with the practical. In the morning, the bowl was not empty. There were 3 dull coins in it, and a splintered roof lath with writing scratched by a nail, Millhouse, second beam. The words were shy and wrong spelled, and somehow exacting. The Millhouse sat at the village's shoulder like a heavy thought. If the second beam failed, the wheel would crush its own mouth. We went together because courage is more believable when it makes noise. The mill race had half silted, and a sedge tuft had grown where the miller's boy used to stand fishing for eels in a way that looked too serious for sport. The second beam had bowed and split like a loaf that never fully baked. We took measurements by habit and by eyes, handspans, thumb widths, the width of a sigh between crack and river. Thomas's strength, which previously had been a fact used by other men, became now a living tool. He pushed and steadied and grinned with a gentle pride that felt new on him. Margot wedged a cleat and tapped it with a mallet in a way that was the opposite of panic-patient accurate, almost affectionate. I took my father's hammer and matched a new rhythm to the memory of his old one. That was the first time the hammer stopped feeling like a memorial and started feeling like an instrument. We had brought nothing to eat but the stubbornness to keep going, which is an odd kind of food but filling if shared. By late afternoon the wheel turned with a sound like someone clearing a throat politely. The river made its agreement. Known business as usual, provided business meant enduring. We went home with sawdust on our sleeves, and something that was not quite joy. Joy is extravagant, but closer to permission. We left the bowl in the square. No speech accompanied it, no grand claim. I drew a new chalk line, once the first one had scuffed out rituals, benefit from repetition. Lou planted himself on the low wall, like a gargoyle designed to witness. He nodded at every passer-by, like the keeper of a gate to a city that had forgotten it had gates. Toward dusk, a boy in a too big cap came and stood by the square, gnawing at the string tied around his wrist, trying to decide whether he was allowed to be seen. When he finally stepped forward and laid a single ancient penny in the bowl, he did it the way you place a candle where the wind has a say. The penny made a sound that lives in me still. Metal is the opposite of silence. That night sleep did not arrive. It negotiated terms. There is a stage, after great dying, when your head insists on inventory, counting blankets, counting footsteps that might be yours, counting rafters, to make sure the roof is still committed. I lay awake and rehearsed the placement of tool, handles the feel of the hammer's nick against my thumb, the order in which tomorrow might want to happen. The mind, like a good joiner, lays out the work before it cuts. At first light, Margot said, "If people are to come asking, we should have a rate." A rate. I looked stupidly proud of the word. It sounded like a tool, with measurements carved along the shaft. "What does a rate cost?" "Less than the arrogance of not having one," she said. "Enough for bread and a small wedge of cheese. Enough that we do not apologize for eating." Her mouth twitched into almost smile. Grief had not left her, but it had been asked to sit politely at the far end of the bench. Thomas wanted to know whether we needed permission to work. The question came out innocent and complicated both. Permission is the kind of law that feels ethical until hunger cross-examines it. Lou answered by way of proverb, which was his way of letting us do the thinking. A spade does not wait for a scroll, and a roof is a citizen of rain. We took it to mean we would proceed. On our way back to the square, a pale wind folded down from the hills and made a trembling companionship with the barley stubble. The church bell maybe rang once, or maybe that was my memory ringing it. The world after great interruption has to be coaxed not with trumpets, but with repeatable small acts. There would be time later for arguments and prices and the mischief of law. In the first day's ledger we wrote only the round numbers. 4 people, 1 hammer, 1 chalk square, 1 bowl, that promised to be itself again tomorrow. Behind us a door lifted and dropped on its latch as a test. Somewhere a pot lid rattled. Somewhere a horse turned in a stall. The village wasn't speaking yet, but it had cleared its throat. It began with a rumour that walked on tired legs. The manor over the ridge, people said, had wheat lying down like men after battle. Too few hands to cut, too few backs to bind, too few carts to carry. A rumour like that is a kind of weather. It changes how you breathe, even before it arrives. By noon, the rumour had names. The steward himself came to the market square, with a purse that made a reliable sound when it moved, a sound designed to carry. He did not shout. He set the purse on a trestle, looked at our chalk square and our bowl as if they were official documents, and said, "Any who come tomorrow coin and food. I will not ask about obligations." The last sentence was the shock. In the old style of things, obligation had a theology attached. You worked because you belonged to a particular patch of duty. Now the steward was bargaining with hunger, as if it were a man he could see. Thomas leaned closer to me, his voice small, with hope he didn't want to spook. "Is this allowed?" "Allowed? By whom?" Margot said. "By the rain, by the wheat that will rot if no one lifts it. I would rather ask the weather for leave than a piece of paper that has never learned the smell of grain." She turned to the steward. "I can fit a brace under a broken wagon tongue and set staves to a leaky barrel, pay for a day, and I will bring 1 more pair of hands with me." The steward looked relieved the way a man looks when a bridge holds. "Bring 2, he said. "Bring a town." We set out at first light, carrying the easy part of our tools, and leaving the heavy part for confidence to grow into later. The path crossed the ridge and fell into a shallow bowl of fields that had been combed by wind. Some of the wheat had folded itself, as if trying to sleep. Men used to timing their year by bells, now measured it by how much sun touched their necks before the break. I have never seen a morning so full of problems that were grateful to be solved. The steward tried to find the old grammar for giving orders and failed, then tried a new one and succeeded. "You know your work. Tell me what you need." That single sentence drew a line across the world. It meant our knowledge had weight. It meant he was going to learn listening the way a child learns letters awkwardly at first, then with appetite. We divided ourselves, not by who was important, but by who could reach which rung of the ladder without swearing. Thomas took the bundles at the cart mouth because his arms were a well you could draw strength from without lowering a bucket. Margot scanned the wagons and read their weaknesses. Like a midwife reads a brow, this axle would do with a wedge. That pin would want a thong of rawhide. These boards could be convinced to behave if spoken to in the right order. I walked the edge of the field where the standing grain met the fallen marking places that needed scything before the wind invented new damage. There is a pace that belongs to harvest, and it returned to us like an old song that knows your name. We sweated without complaint and discovered that sweat is a kind of grammar as well subject-verb result. At midday, the steward sent out a boy with a pot of porridge and a heel of cheese, so large it looked like a religious object. He watched us eat the way a shepherd watches a stream in drought, counting what returns. "Say what you want for the day," he said finally, voice careful as if the words might bruise. The old numbers arrived, first shy and malnourished. No one believed in them. Margot named a figure that did not apologize for the size of our hunger or the size of our skill. The steward flinched, then looked at the field, at the sky, at the way the carts waited like questions. "Done," he said, quicker than pride would have preferred. The air changed temperature. A bargain had struck metal. We did not behave like conquerors. We behaved like people who had been invited to remain human. That distinction mattered. Work under this new agreement stood up straighter. We took the afternoon as proof of concept. The reaper's rhythm returned to our hands. The stacked sheaves looked like orderly thoughts after a long grief. When a wagon's rim split with a sound like a sigh giving up, Margot knelt, slipped off her kerchief, twisted it into a tourniquet to hold the rim until we could bind it with a new strip of wood. She tied the knot with a small flourish that justified the word craft. On the ridge, other stewards were squinting through their own sums. You could feel their thinking like weather as well, the moment when they decide whether to be parsimonious or practical, whether to frighten labour back into old lanes, or meet it where it had moved to. We were not the only village being measured by a purse and a need. When the sun slipped to a position that promised a kind evening, we turned the carts home. The steward tried to thank us with words that belonged to banners and tournaments. We answered with words that belonged to tables and cupboards. "The beam in your mill," I said, "because bargains pay interest in manners, we have stabilised it for now. Bring us a better length of timber when you can spare one, and we'll set it properly." He nodded, as if grateful to be given a future. Back in the square, the bowl looked less ceremonial and more like a ledger. There were additional coins in it, and a strip of bark scratched with a request about a collapsed buyer. It turns out that need is contagious, in a good way, when it sees the possibility of solution. Lou read the bark as if it were a poem with odd scansion, and then handed it to me like a baton. "You'll want to eat before you put your back against that," he said. The advice pleased him for its usefulness. We cooked barley with a piece of bone that remembered meat, and Margot let herself be proud of the day without looking sideways to see if pride was permitted. "I have been paid properly for my hands," she said into her bowl, which is to say, she said it to all the other bowls we would eat from. Thomas looked at his palms as if they had grown older in a nice way. "Feels like someone returned something they borrowed a long time," he said. Other changes took less obvious forms. In the quarries and smithies, we began to hear that men who had been Gloucester's lads for a decade were suddenly masters of their shift, that women who had always been seen as hands for kitchen fire were now seen as hands for barrel hoop and lathe. Not everyone approved. Approval isn't a currency you can keep in a jar, but necessity approves. The clever, before opinion, has had its tea. That night, I counted what we had and what we owed, not just in coins, but in nerve. We had dared to set a rate. We had been met, not struck down. That makes a person taller from the inside. It also makes a person visible, which is more dangerous. As if reading the same ledger written on my ribs, Lou said, "The rope pulls both ways. Do not be surprised when it does." He was not warning us off. He was telling us to eat well, because the road is not only uphill in one direction. In the days that followed, the bowl filled more predictably, and our chalk square acquired the scuffs that a good idea wears. The steward's purse walked through the square again, and other purses learned its gait. We did not turn the world upside down. We did, however, place a hand on its rim and test whether it might be tipped a little toward fairness. You could feel the angle change in the way people said please and thank you, and in the way they stopped saying master quite so reflexively. Even the dogs seemed to expect a different table scrap. I slept better that week. Not the heavy sleep of exhaustion that comes with harvest, no matter who profits, but the honest sleep of having spoken a number aloud and not been struck by lightning for it. Morning felt like a plan you could make again. On my bench, I laid out the hammer, the adze, the plane. Each tool looked a little less like an heirloom and a little more like a pen you could write the next lines with. It came back in small flames instead of a wall of fire. Not the roar we had known, not the coughs stacked like cordwood, not the cartwheels printing funerals in mud. This time, it was a spark on the far edge of the lane. A child flushed, and too still, a grandmother who said the bread tasted like iron, and then slept all day, a carter with a tender swelling in the wrong place. The air did not crowd the lungs in panic. It waited. We waited with it, eyes narrowed counting. Margot found the chalk first. She had kept a stub in a crock with pebbles, a habit from when prices were announced on the tally board, and then argued with the stamina of saints. If your boy is fevered, she told the mother, we mark the door so strangers know the floor's rules. She drew a small white cross on the plank, not a curse, not a blessing, a notice. The chalk line looked almost meek, and therefore powerful, like a seam that would hold because it did not pretend to be fancy. We agreed on signs before we agreed on explanations. A cross meant keep distance. A rag on the latch meant bring broth and leave it on the step. A clay bowl under the eaves meant someone inside needed water. The system was not invented whole. We made it the way you weave one strand at a time, checking each against the others to see if it will take weight. Lou, whose memory was a cart without a backboard, said he had seen door marks once as a boy for a pox of another name. Back then they prayed and waited, he said. We will pray, but we will also wait cleverly. Vinegar became a citizen. We had enough from a barrel that had gone beyond wine last winter and into the territory of useful mistakes. We tore cloth into strips, knotted them to a pole, so we could offer them without reaching in, soaked them, and told people, wipe hands, wipe rafters, wipe again. The smell laced the lanes like nettles in soup sharp, cleansing a little rude. It did not cure the old plague or the new shivers. Not like a miracle would, but it taught our hands the habit of not being careless. That by itself made the village feel less flammable. Cats, formerly independent citizens, with a tax of mice and disdain, were bribed into service. Thomas discovered that offcuts from the tannery appealed to them more than sermons. We lured 24 into the barns and kitchens. You can't negotiate with fleas, he said, but you can evict their landlords. We stopped shooing the cats from tables and began greeting them as colleagues. At the market, a sailor with a voice like rope told a story about ports further south, where newcomers were made to sit their weather out before stepping inside the walls. 40 days, he said, long enough to outrun a fever and discover where the luck travels. He shrugged when asked where the number came from. From the counting fingers of whoever first feared correctly, he said. We had no walls, no harbour chains, no magistrate with a bell. But we had a meadow by the mill race, and a stand of willows that could hide a hut. We built the hut in an afternoon, because you can build anything in an afternoon if fear is a partner. 4 stakes, a crossbar wattled sides, mudded to keep the wind from gossiping through a roof that respectable rain would approve. We laid a pallet a second for a watcher, a small table for a jug, and a candle stub. We did not call it exile. We called it the Willow House. People went there for fevers, for coughs like hammered tin, for 3 days of, I don't feel like myself. We stood outside and spoke to them as if a fence were a courtesy, not a judgment. The priest came late to this work by design. He watched the chalk, the vinegar, the cats, the willow house, as a man watches a child learning to tie knots, curious, sceptical, ready to intervene, only if the knot becomes a noose. We must not practice cruelty under the name of caution, he said, not as a rebuke, but as a compass. No door barred from the outside, no name spoken as if it were a sickness. We agreed. He carried to the marked doors what he called the one sacrament that could be easily spared attention. Ritual followed, as it does whenever fear and order hold hands. Basins appeared at thresholds, not to baptize, to rinse. Shoes began to live just outside instead of just inside. We learned to greet with a palm lifted instead of a palm offered. Children learned a song for scrubbing a counting off tune that made the minutes behave. Smoke cures nothing, but smoke declares seriousness. We burned damp straw in little heaps so the air itself looked like it meant business. The village felt like a workshop, tools hung where you could reach them without thinking, rules made in the same tone you use when setting a plane's blade. Because rumour breeds where knowledge leaves a ditch, we tried to fill ditches quickly. When a man from over the ridge spat into the dust and said, "It is in the foreigners, it is in their wells," the priest asked him very gently to come with him for a walk. He took the man along the cart track, where bales of cloth moved, where sacks of grain had rubbed shoulders in a slow migration, where rats had been arguing a case for years no one had listened to. If you blame a well, he said, you will get the pleasure of shouting. If you blame carts and rats and hands, you will get the boredom of washing. Choose your pleasure. The man did not apologize. Few do, but he stopped being useful to rumour. The willow house gave us its first account in the little girl with the flushed cheeks. Her mother slept on the second pallet, rising to sponge her forehead. We set a schedule by making marks on the hut door, small cross for morning broth, dot for a jug refill line, for someone read a psalm through the wall. On the fourth day the fever slid away like a dish you lost hold of, but somehow caught with the other hand. We did not run to the square with trumpets. We changed the chalk on their cottage door from a cross to a circle, which meant thank you, all is well. Symbols disinfect what words can contaminate. The hardest part was our speech. How to talk about risk without selling panic by the ladle. How to ask a neighbour to step back without insulting the past when stepping forward had been courtship and trade. Margot invented a phrase that worked. Let us be careful so we can be careless again later. People liked that. It promised a return to the informal if we could endure the formal for a while. Not everything obeyed our neatness. A man refused the willow house and lay on his own pallet in his own smoke and died anyway, in the old way, with grief bumping at the door. We walked past, with our heads respectful and our mouths tight. The chalk on his door washed down in rain, leaving a white vein on the plank, like a scar that would not answer to reason. We updated nothing about our rules, except the way we said them softer, slower, without pretending success owed us favours. In the evenings, the lane smelled of soup and vinegar and wood smoke. You could follow those scents like lines on a map. Work continued. Roofs, mended beams, set fields, dressed. But the work had a new habit riding pillion, the habit of thinking about where hands had been. We surprised ourselves by how quickly we could turn a lesson into a reflex. The body is an excellent student when the tuition is paid in memory. The sailor's story about 40 days became part of our weather too. We began to treat arrivals as weather you shelter from until you know whether it brings rain or Sunday. A peddler camped near the hedgerow, waited out a little, lent of his own invention before walking the street with his needles and charms. Prudence is not an insult, he said, pitching his voice like a salesman of good sense. People bought from him because he belonged now to the grammar we were writing. When the flare passed, and it did pass, as small fires do when they find no spare thatch to climb, we did not erase the chalk from our pockets. We kept the willow house standing, swept stocked with 2 clean blankets and a jar of the thick vinegar from the bottom of the barrel. Cats kept their privileges. Basins stayed. The new greetings remained as if they had been old ones all along. We had built ourselves not a fortress, but a way of moving that leaked less harm. What we learned was not a cure, but a choreography. It said, here is where you place your feet when fear enters. Here is where you put your hands. Here is how long you hum the scrubbing song. Here is how far you stand and still be kind. Here is how you make a mark that informs without wounding. We were not scholars, but we owned a library of gestures, now bound in chalk and cloth and cat hair and steam. The village, our small, stubborn book, could be reread whenever the air grew uncertain. The rumour arrived as rumours prefer to travel riding the loudest mouth available and paying no tolls. It came with two men from over the ridge, faces red with borrowed righteousness, who tramped into the market square at the hour when gossip is most soluble in sunlight. They stood beside the well where water and talk share a bucket and announced that the sickness, the fevers, the thin cough, dragging at doors, these were not weather or chance or a flea with itinerant ambitions. No, it was the work of strangers. Poison, one of them said, tasting the word as if it was strong drink. They throw powders in the wells at night. I know a place where he did not know a place. Rumour never brings a map. The square bristled the way. A cat bristles a collective decision to look larger than you feel. People edged closer to the well, as if bodies could shield water from nouns. The traders who had stitched themselves to our market these past months, cloth sellers with their neatly folded blues and madder reds, a spice peddler whose wares smelled like places we will never see, stood a little apart, guilty only of being elsewhere once. The air trembled on a question mark. Margot put down her basket of staves with the sound of someone closing a lid on panic. "Who saw powder?" she asked. "Name a night. Name a hand." Her voice was not loud. It was level, which is more dangerous to nonsense. The men were ready for heat, not temperature. "Everybody knows," said the taller one, which is the most cowardly sentence in the language. "You can taste it, can't you? The water has a..." He searched for a word and found only his own tongue. Before anger could rise to the lip of the well, like bad scum, the priest stepped into the square. He did not hold a crucifix. He held a rope. "Walk," he said to the two men, as if inviting them to inspect a fence. He led them along the cart track that braided through the village where ruts carry stories and droppings, mark supply chains. "Count," he said, pointing with the rope. "Bales of cloth last week 7, sacks of grain 12. Which wagons were covered, which were not. How many times did the tide of rats change direction? When the weather changed, which barns hold cats? Now, that did not." Before he did not wait for answers. "If you blame a well," he said, "you earn the pleasure of shouting. If you blame carts and hands, and the fact that cheese wishes to travel to places where men have also travelled, you earn the boredom of washing and sweeping and keeping a basin near every door. Choose where you would like to spend your day." We followed them like a classroom with no walls. Even the cloth sellers came carefully folding their fear into their bundles so they would not drop it and make a mess. At the far edge of the square, the priest stopped and flicked his rope at the hedgerow where a rat considered us with the insolence of survival. "There is your poisoner," he said, "and he has no religion." The shorter of the two men tried for dignity and found only heels. "You make light of evil," he said. "On the contrary," the priest replied, "I am trying to make evil heavy enough that it falls where it belongs. Reason is not a trumpet, it is a weight. You set it down in the centre and watch the furniture adjust." There was still the matter of taste. People dream better if their tongues are consulted. Margot scooped a pail, dipped a cup, and handed it to the taller man. "Drink or don't," she said. "The water has been drawing itself out of that stone since before you had the idea to be afraid." He did not drink because cowardice prefers thirst to evidence. Old Lou stepped in with a flourish, swallowed, smacked his lips, and declared, "Tastes like water that has minded its own business." The square laughed the way a knot loosens, but fear is resourceful. It ducks behind reason and reappears pale and breathless. "What if they poison at night?" said someone. "You could not identify the rumour's favourite disguise when cats sleep and men do not watch." The spice peddler lifted a brow like a curtain. "Friend," he said, "cats are freelance. They sleep as part of their plan to stay awake." He whistled. 3 of our newly salaried mousers, tilted their heads at once professional as magistrates. The laughter returned brittle at first, then honest. We needed more than mockery, though. We needed a story to go out and work while we slept, so we made one. That afternoon, sitting on the low wall by the well, we composed a tale in the key of practical comedy. In the tale, a stranger crept at night with a pouch of powder bright as the devil's dandruff. At the well, he pinched a bit between 2 fingers, but a cat named Dame Vinegar, because the square enjoys a good pun, leaped onto the bucket and demanded to see his license. The stranger, flustered, dropped the pouch into his own shoes. In the morning, he blamed the water for burning his feet. Moral, said Lou, who enjoys morals the way boys enjoy tops. If you don't wash your hands, your shoes will drink for you. We told the tale at the tavern and in the lanes, and to the boy who runs messages and repeats them with embellishments, you can take or leave. It spread, as humour does, by finding the mouths most in need of mischief. We did not tell the tale to humiliate the fearful. We told it because stories are the opposite of silence, and silence is where suspicion multiplies. The cloth sellers kept their place in the square. The spice peddler sold a little pouch of mustard seed, labelled Antidote to Stupidity. It was a joke, with a decent flavour and a better argument. Not all arguments needed drama. The mother of the fevered girl from the Willow house came to the well and stood beside the traders, without ceremony passing them a heel of her bread as if it were a neighbourly tax. They brought broth when I needed it, she said, to no one in particular. They did not bring powder. That sentence fit the well's stone, as if the builders had left a space for it. We did one more practical thing, because talk, however sensible, can evaporate. We rigged a simple cover for the well, a hinged wooden lid, with a bar that lay across it like a gentleman's cane. We posted a chalk mark that meant lift with a clean cloth, replace when done. We did it without fanfare, because fanfare invites vandals. The men from over the ridge saw the lid, saw that it made their outrage unemployed, and walked home along the hedgerow, where rats do not applaud. The counter-rumour worked the way a good salve works, not by killing pain instantly, but by creating a surface under which healing chooses to occur. Days went by. The chalk marks on doors shifted from crosses to circles, and then to nothing at all. The Willow house kept its blankets folded. The well lid became part of the scenery. The cloth sellers learned to say basin in our accent. The square exhaled in instalments. When the men returned a week later, perhaps, or the shape of them in another pair of men, their grievance had changed colours. Now they complained about wages, not wells, that our rates were a bad example, that their stewards were suffering, that the world had tilted in a way that made their old boots squeak. We listened because listening is also a tool. We offered them water. They refused again because refusing had become their style. Margot smiled without teeth. When you are ready to drink, she said, the rope will still be here. There is a discipline to living with one well and many stories. You tend the rope, you scrape the moss. You teach the children not to lean so far they can see their fear looking up at them. You keep the lid clean and the bucket honest. And when someone whispers poison, you answer with a walk along the cart, track a lesson about rats, a joke about cats, a cup held out with a steady hand, and a story so serviceable it can haul water. The sound returned before the crowds did. Not bells, not the cart's iron complaint on stone, but the domestic orchestra of work, the rasp of a plane, the bass thud of a mallet like a heart practising, wool whispering as it gives up burrs, a poker ringing the rim of a grate to make room for flame. Noise is a way a town remembers itself. It began in the cooper's shed because emptiness dislikes a ready bench. Margot stood in the doorway and measured the space with her breath. Her late husband had left his tools in fair order. as if he had only stepped out to see whether the sky still behaved. "Help me pull the bench into the light," she said. We dragged it so the window's square found the planed surface and turned dust into constellations. She set her palm on the bench as you would on the brow of a horse you hope will not spook. Barrel staves, like people, can be coaxed back into usefulness if heat and patience collaborate. We lit a short brazier and bent the first hoop until it admitted its error. Soon the shed smelled of steam and oak and iron. The trick, Margot said, is to talk to the staves in the order they wish to be spoken to. She tapped them one by one with her adze. There is no grammar stricter than Wood's. Every misplaced word becomes a leak. Children arrive the way birds do when seed appears quietly at first, then convinced of their welcome by the fact of it. They perched on the sill and watched the circle forming from straight things, a paradox they could hold in their eyes. "Fetch me the short hoop," Margot said, and a girl with braids that had outgrown their ribbons sprang to the tool wall, solemn with sudden usefulness. She brought the right hoop on the first try and was paid with instruction. You see how the end is scarfed. It's a handshake that agrees to hold. Thomas, who had lifted grain by the acre, looked down at his hands and said he was tired of strength, being only a blunt instrument. He built himself a forge from a scandal of bricks and a bellows that had lost its fear of smoke. He did not know the complicated names for iron's moods, but he learned them by heat and quench, that red means persuasion, not fury, that straw yellow is the colour of promises you can test with a file. He began with nails because civilization rests on very small decisions made in large numbers. The first nail bent against his will. The second agreed. By the 10th, the anvil had learned his signature. An apprentice found him because boys find fire. Not a boy as the town would have defined one, but a girl in her second decade with sleeves rolled high and a stare that dismissed anyone who had a problem with sleeves. Eileen had worked in the manor kitchen where knives argue with onions. She had grown bored of chopping what always surrendered. "I want a task that talks back," she said. Thomas, whose integrity included not making grand speeches about fairness, shrugged like a man agreeing with the weather. "Hammer falls straight," he said. "If you can make it fall straight, and again straight, the door is open." The sight of Eileen at the forge upset precisely the number of people you would expect. Old opinions prefer to be consulted before they are contradicted. The priest chose, as was becoming his habit, to show up with a question instead of a decree. "If the saints watch," he asked mildly, "do you believe they want the barrel to leak?" It is hard to argue that a craft should be worse in order to honour an idea. Complaints withered into habits of staring that given enough days forgot what they had been staring about. Old Lou did not join a shop because he already owned the only universal tool narrative. He made a rope walk of the lane between his cottage and the elm. His lessons were about spin more than about fibre. "Guy wants to be rope the way words want to be," sentence, he said. "If your fingers keep time, the strand will forget its wish to fly apart." He taught the children to anchor the twist against their knees, to feed the fibre in a steady hunger, to pinch when ambition ran ahead of skill. The first lengths were lumpy as porridge. By week's end, they looked like decisions ready to be trusted. Books are also a kind of rope. A scrivener from the next town, who had survived by copying prayers until the candles forgot where the dark began, offered to keep company with letters in our granary on market evenings. We turned a grain chest into a lectern and laid out the alphabet like seed. He did not bother with Latin's vanity at first. He started with the names we needed: roof, beam, nail, cheese rate, basin, vinegar. Children traced the words in flour and then blew them away with a wicked joy. Blowing away is a pedagogy you make room for tomorrow's lesson by watching today's disappear into competence. The guilds we had known were mostly memories with Jews. Their rules had assumed a river of hands flowing through the same narrow channel. Our river had changed course. We built new banks to match. We made a list on the granary door of who could do what and for how long before the work soured. Not contracts exactly. Contracts require parchment and a tolerance for boredom, but promises posted where weather could see them and hold us to account. 2 days a week the cooper's bench is for Margot, and whomever she names it said 1 day for repairs declared urgent by roofs. The forge will answer nails and hinges first, then ornament if the week has mercy. Payment will be recorded in bread, coincloth, or hours. It was ledger as literature, our finest genre. We discovered that teaching preserves the teacher. Margot's hands became younger when she placed a draw knife correctly in an apprentice's grip. Thomas spoke less but better. The forge's grammar improved his own. Eline's hammer strokes grew elegant, not delicate. The distinction mattered to her. Beauty, she said, wiping her forearm with a clean rag, is how you know a thing will last. In the rope walk, Lou invented a song with a beat sneaky enough that even the stubbornest fibre had to keep time. The scrivener watched a boy write his name without asking permission, and for a second his face looked like a window had opened in a wall he'd assumed was load-bearing. Markets noticed what work had decided. A tanner from 2 parishes away sent a message on bark. Could we spare nails and hoops for his vats if he sent hide offcuts for our cats? He had figured out the new economy's first theorem: all good bargains are ecosystems. We answered yes, and the first week smelt of iron and vinegar and the rude honesty of raw skin. The cats held a meeting and declared the arrangement sound. Of course there were misfires. A set of hoops split because the oak had been in a hurry to be a tree and bore knots like bad excuses. A length of rope frayed at a crucial splice and dropped a bucket into the well with a slap that made everyone swear in unison. The scrivener attempted Latin on a day when the children's attention had already been spent on the discovery that tadpoles are indecently fascinating. His lesson died of dignity. But we repaired, replaced, revised. Every failure made a tool sharper or a rule kinder. Wives who had been told their competence belonged to kitchen shadows moved in the light. Husbands who had assumed their importance came in units of bulk, learned to measure themselves in accuracy. Apprentices learned that a question asked before a mistake was not insolence but thrift. The word master softened not because mastery mattered less, but because it had stopped being a fence and remembered it was a horizon. In the evenings, the village hummed like a hive that didn't mind if you watched. The cooper's shed leaked lamplight through the plank seam and made yellow stripes on the lane. The forge beat time you could set a prayer to. The ropewalks' finished coils waited like sleeping serpents, good-tempered and useful. From the granary came the scratch of quill and the occasional triumphant shout of a child who had just made a letter stand up without falling over. We ate better, not suddenly, but as a consequence. Work that stays put invites soup to improve. You cannot simmer in a hurry. Bread remembered its right to a second rise. Cheese made remarks about patience, and then became itself more thoroughly. We did not say prosperity. The word sticks in the throat of people who know how fast a wind can change. We said enough and meant it. By the time the first frost scribbled the edges of the fields, our town had an inside again. Not merely walls and roofs, but habits that held. We had made a world small enough to understand and big enough to share. If you wanted a summary, you could find it in the way Margot hung her tools, the adze, the draw knife, the hoop driver, all within reach, all with their edges, oiled all, expecting to be used tomorrow by whatever hands had earned the right today. There would be arguments again about rates about who decides urgency, about whether iron should be spent on hinges or hope. There would be visitors with opinions loud enough to make a well nervous. The rope, as Lou kept reminding us, would pull both ways. But for now the sound of work braided with the sound of evening, and the village dialed its breathing to match. If a stranger had asked what we were doing, we might have said, "We are rebuilding the tools that will rebuild us." And if he had asked how long that would take, we might have pointed to the bench, pulled into the light, and said, "As long as the dust keeps finding reasons to sparkle." Heat rose like a reason. No one had the patience to argue. July arrived with a hard white coin of a sun, and stayed as if it had paid rent. The lanes smelled of warm thatch horses that believed in idleness vinegar, turned sweet at the jar's rim. Work shortened its sentences. Even the forge's hammer agreed to say less. We set our benches deeper into shade, and let talk do more of the lifting. The first dancer stood up at the tavern courtyard, where the elm throws its one decent shadow. A woman named Joan, broad-shouldered, not built for frivolous ailments, put down her cup, frowned as if trying to remember who owned her feet, then began to step, tap, step, heel, turn, with a precision that did not ask her permission. No fiddler saw this coming. There was no drum, unless you count a heart that had changed languages. Someone laughed as we laugh when surprise is kind, and Joan's mouth tried for laughter too, but found its corners busy. She danced faster. Sweat wrote a letter down the centre of her back. Two men joined to be pleasant, thinking this was merriment beginning without them. They clapped. Joan did not hear. The courtyard filled, as attention fills sideways, then in. The priest came hatless sleeves, pushed up, looking not like authority, but like someone's tired brother. Chair, he said, to no one in particular, for whoever needs to fall toward it. Thomas fetched the big oaken one that behaves like furniture even when calamity sits on it. Margot filled a bowl with water, salted it as you do when you cure grief into something edible, and set it on the step. When a body forgets where it lives, she said, "Show it a taste, it knows." By then Joan's pattern had abandoned music for geometry. Her steps found a square and tried to erase it by walking its edges. Her eyes were not vacant. They held a conversation with a thing we could not see, and that seemed impolite to interrupt, so we tended the perimeter. Old Lou tapped his knee in fours, soft enough not to provoke. "Even houses complain when summer sits on them," he murmured. The priest nodded once, a small agreement with a larger mystery. When Joan fell, she fell as a tree falls, with an argument decided beforehand. Two hands were there, Margot's and Thomas's, to fold her to the chair and make the landing a courtesy. She gripped their arms as if they were a ladder she meant to keep. We passed a cup across the front row of worry, and she sipped without recognizing it as mercy. Then her breath returned to the sensible world one measure at a time, and she stared at her feet with a fierceness that was partly gratitude and partly insulted surprise. Someone joked gently that the shoes had auditioned for a better life. Laughter arrived like a damp cloth on a hot brow. We thought that was the story, a single, curious chapter. It was the prologue. The next day, a boy in the rope walk began to hop, then to stamp, then to swing his arms, as if conducting an orchestra made entirely of bees. He laughed, then hiccuped, then cried, without either sorrow or consent. "Chair someone," said who was not the priest. Our town had learned how to repeat a useful page. The salty bowl migrated there too. "You are not wrong," Lou told the air, as if addressing fear directly. "You are only noisy." A day later, 3 women in the shade behind the granary took turns not being able to sit. They danced in a line that made no music and hired no tune. Children watched from the haven of a doorway, small as secrets. We began a ledger, not to dignify the thing with numbers, but to refuse it the protection of vagueness. By week's end, we had 7 names and 2 afternoons, where the courtyard made a slow, relentless percussion with its own dust. We behaved badly exactly once. A man laughed in the wrong key, sharp and purple, and made a show of being above whatever this was. He imitated a jerking foot and bowed to his own comedy. Before shame could do the slow work of correction, the priest put a hand on the man's shoulder and pressed until the shoulder remembered that it belonged to a neck with ears. "Do not sneer at a vocabulary you do not need," he said. The man found something interesting in his shoe. Afterwards, he carried chairs. We learned quickly which kindnesses travelled well between bodies and which did not. Cold cloths soothed. Names spoken softly gave the feet something to return to. Music helped only if it behaved like water and let its shape be borrowed. Hard clapping made things worse. Sharp noises suggested the wrong kind of audience. Margot taught a trick, with breathing in for 4 hold, for 4 out for 6, a way of telling a frightened body that the exhale is allowed to be longer than the fear. There were stories, because a village is a factory that turns whatever happens into narrative. Some said it was a saint jealous of summer festivals that had withered in plague years, demanding a party from whoever had a pulse left. Some said the devil had discovered boredom and was paying it forward. Others blamed the rye, which had grown with a stain some seasons and tasted of headache. The scrivener, a man who knows the power of respectable names, muttered one that meant the mind affects the flesh on purpose. He looked neither pleased nor certain. We did not bother to decide. Deciding would have been a way to imagine we were tall enough to cast shade on whatever moved beneath us. We preferred the shorter, more repairable task: keep chairs near, keep salt near, keep patience in the part of the cupboard you can open without unlocking something. The willow house, built for fevers, took a turn as a cooling den. People went there not to be cut off, but to be unobserved by the heavy end of attention. We made screens of sacking and set a picture where anyone could find it without having to speak. Children did what they do when adults are overwhelmed. They invented a game that made the frightening things small. They chalked hopscotch grids in the yard and wrote beside them in flour, 1 square only 2, at most, as if teaching feet to bargain. They counted in rhythms that matched the breathing trick. A girl told another, with a seriousness capable of saving lives, "If your legs forget, tell your hands to clap very quietly, like mice." It was not science, but it was better than scolding. Once late in the spell, a small procession crossed the square. 3 dancers supported between 4 neighbours, 1 chair carried like a relic. Margot walking backwards so she could watch the faces. Thomas going ahead to shoe dogs and pried out of the way. The priest did not lead. He walked at the edge as you walk beside a stream you would like to hear speak. Old Lou came behind with a bucket of water that sloshed moral instruction all over his shoes. People opened doors and put their eyes away, which is a rarer courtesy than anything you can hang on a nail. We tried not to let the thing hire fear for a scribe, so we told a different story beside it, the way you read a child to sleep next to thunder. At the tavern after the worst day, Lou stood and offered the one kind of sermon that passes, in such places, a toast. "To the animal," he said, raising his cup, "who remembers for us when we cannot afford to, and to the village, who gives the animal somewhere safe to be ridiculous." We drank to that because the thing required a better ritual than wincing. Then, as weather does, what weather does the heat broke? Rain arrived the way good letters do, earlier than expected and honest. The first storm came hunting with a smell of iron and a drumming that put a hand on every roof at once. It washed the square, chilled the ire out of afternoon, and seated the dancers in their own bodies again. Not all at once. No trumpet. One morning we realized chairs had wandered back indoors of their own accord. We did not unpack the why. The why unpacks itself when it's ready or not at all. We did what we could keep, kept a jar of coarse salt hung by the tavern door, kept the screens in the willow house, kept a rule posted where boredom would read it. If you must move, move toward water. Cats resumed their specialized disdain. The forge found its long sentences again. The cooper's shed oiled the ads with the confidence of someone who has seen worse. And we kept the song. Children took it from the rope walk and the granary to the doorsteps, the counting tune for scrubbing that we had first invented for fever. They slowed its middle and lengthened its end so that breath had somewhere safe to land. Some afternoons you could hear it stitched into play, 4 beats for hop, 4 beats for still 6. For laughter you didn't have to explain. The village learned, as if from an old manual we had misplaced, and recovered that bodies like beams and barrels need allowances. Leave space for wood to swell. Leave room in the day where the mind can stamp its feet without breaking the floor. By harvest, the thing had become a story we told, with a laugh carefully measured to its subject. Remember, when the tavern invented geometry, we would say and carry a chair out for a stranger without making a parade of it. We hung a little plaque inside our heads, courtesy for strange days. It matched the other plaques we had been making base in by the door cat's welcome rates are spoken aloud. We were not cured of anything. We were merely magnificently better at living with ourselves when the temperature rose and memory tried to force its way out through our heels. Autumn arrived with a tidy edge, as if the year had decided to sweep. The first frost scribbled silver on stubble. Breath became a visible opinion. Work lengthened its sentences again. We were ready to speak them. That was the morning. The riders came 3 horses, the colour of old argument, a clerk with a case of scrolls, and 2 men whose talent was making silence count. They chose the square, as officials do, for the acoustics of stone. The clerk unrolled a parchment that smelled of candle and distance, broke a red seal with the care of an altar boy, and read in a voice trained to be heard over markets and misgivings. The words were the kind that carry iron nails inside them. Wages shall be as before, no labourer to depart his accustomed master without licence. Those who entice servants shall be punished stocks and fines to correct disobedience. The document imagined a world that had forgotten how much it had bled. We listened because listening wastes less energy than shouting. Beside me, Thomas stood that particular stillness he keeps for weather he cannot bargain with. Margot folded her arms across her apron and watched the clerk as if he were a piece of timber you suspect will warp. Old Lou, whose posture makes all proclamations look temporary, leaned on his stick and counted the pigeons. The cloth sellers turned their bolts inside their carts so the colours would not have to witness humiliation. When the clerk finished, he made the extra mistake of looking satisfied. For the common peace, he added as a garnish. Peace is a word that behaves itself differently depending on who is eating. No one answered in banners. There was a mutter, a ragged hiss, as breath reconsidered its next move. The riders posted copies of the law on the granary door and on the lich gate and above the tavern lintel where rain and smoke would take turns trying to erase it. Then they rode away to spread arithmetic, the old numbers, back onto a world that no longer contained them. We adjusted. Adjustment is our provincial art. Rates did not vanish, they went discreet. The chalk square was wiped each afternoon and redrawn each morning with a hand that looked like weather. We took more payment in bread and cloth, less in coin with a memory. We worked in bundles, not as solitary bargains, but as choruses. Choruses are harder to fine because fines prefer a face. We taught one another a new grammar for refusal that sounded like acceptance. We will be at the Northfield on Thursday, we would say, if the carts meet us there. It meant we will not walk to be underpaid. but we will help your wheat avoid shame. A week later, the scroll's shadow found us. The steward over the ridge, who had learned listening in our fields and did not enjoy unlearning it, came to fetch 5 hands for a roof that was losing the argument against weather. He named a number the law would approve of and decency would not. Margot answered, as one answers, a child asking to play with a firebrand. If we work for that, the roof will not be the only thing leaking. He winced the truth-left teeth marks, then gestured toward the posted seals. I cannot be seen to soften. We softened for him, which is not the same as surrender. Then let us be seen to work slowly, I said, with a smile generous enough to pass inspection. Old timber dislikes haste. He understood. Men who run estates learn to translate politeness. We went, but we brought a Sabbath with us. Every measure was checked twice. Every mortise introduced to its tenon with courtly manners. Every nail persuaded as if it had a title. We did not cheat him of quality. We cheated the law of speed. Quality newly respected became our strike that nobody could arrest. Law notices patience if it is persistent enough. 2 riders returned with a third, a man whose truncheon had practiced being persuasive. They did not look for negotiations, they looked for examples. They found 3 Thomas for the crime of having a back that recommends him, Margot for the insolence of a woman whose tools answered to her, and me for being the sort of person who holds a hammer like a pen. Disturbers of the peace, their mouths said. Their eyes said disturbers of price. The punishment was chosen for its theatre stocks in the square 3 hours, the lesson accompanied by rain that preferred to fall on the guilty, because the guilty were placed where sky had easiest access. I will not make poetry of it. The wood was honest and did what wood does held. Pain arrived with a craftsman's competence and set to work without small talk. The town watched, and then the town did the thing that saved me from the humiliation the law had purchased. People arranged themselves so that the square looked ordinary. Margot knit. Thomas discussed a hinge with the scrivener, as if both of them had the right to be bored. Old Lou told a story only loud enough for the children to hear. The priest stood beside us, umbrelling nothing but companionship. When rain ran into my eyes, he lifted his sleeve, as if to examine the weather closely, and let the drops choose his cloth instead of my sight. A coin fell, then another, not thrown placed at the base of the stocks with the same matter-of-factness you place a wedge under a rocking table. Children contributed buttons, which are a currency of solidarity. A peddler laid 2 needles, which are worth more than they look. The cloth sellers slid a square of fine blue under my cheek, so wood would not memorize my face. Margot, with the absent-minded grace of someone tidying, set a bowl where coins would not have to lie in the wet. The law had wanted spectacle. We gave it logistics. After, when the man with the truncheon released us with the benevolence of a butcher returning a borrowed knife, we did not attempt a speech. We went to the willow house and sat on its steps because the hut had learned more about tenderness than most buildings. The scrivener counted the coins without announcing the sum. The priest divided them with a tradesman's competence into thirds. For those fined next, he said, handing the first portion to Margot, who immediately looked for a box with a good lock for bread and vinegar, and Salves handing the second to Thomas, who had already named the 2 houses with empty larders. For the chest, he said, giving the last to me. 3 keys, Margot said at once, so generosity doesn't learn bad habits. We picked 3 keepers, the priest, because he embarrasses money into behaving. The cloth peddler, because he could leave town if tempted, and we needed a key that sometimes travelled. And Aline, because iron keeps promises when she stares at it. We called it the chest, never the fund. The chest lived beneath the bench at the cooper's shed, where work could sit on it and remind it of its purpose. When fines came as taxes dressed up as morals, They found us already balanced. We paid them with the same expression we use when weather makes a bad decision, irritation, then activity. Some stewards preferred to flirt with law rather than marry it. Our own tried to use the statute as a shield rather than a sword. He posted the schedule at the granary, naming the tasks he could justify and the rate he could publicly defend, and then added, in his own hand, extra loaf for extra care. It was a joke we all understood. Loaves grew generous. Cheese arrived without a receipt. A man cannot be arrested for being a good host, and a roof cannot be improved by malice. Of course there were sharp days. A boy from 2 parishes over was marched in a rope for leaving his accustomed master, which is the kind of phrase a world uses when it mistakes proximity for belonging. We stood in the square and browsed the vegetables as the rope passed an act of refusal disguised as shopping. The priest walked with the boy to the line where jurisdiction changes its hat, talking the whole way about apples and saints and weather, so the boy's fear would have to interrupt if it wanted to be heard. The riders scowled and made a note. Notes do not arrest anything but ink. We cultivated new slyness. Tools went missing exactly as often as mercy required. Market days multiplied quietly. The law had said nothing about how many there could be, or whether people had to leave them with less bread than they brought. The rope walk doubled as a whispering gallery for rates so-and-so paid fair this week, that Ruth eats labour and spits it out. Accuracy is not slander. It is agriculture for decisions. In the church porch where old nails and newer notices shared a board, we posted a narrow strip of parchment written in the priest's hand. Let US be careful of words. Below it, smaller, peace is not the same as quiet. Below that, in a script that looked suspiciously like Margot's, quality is a speed no law can catch. The notices survived, perhaps because rain enjoys wisdom. By the time winter rehearsed itself on our panes, the statute had not become kinder, but it had become tired of us. Laws prefer victims to puzzles. We had become the latter. We still bargained, but we did it in smiles that were not apologies. We still paid fines, but we paid them with our own arithmetic. We still worked, but in a way that taught timber to wait for justice. If the rope pulled back, we took a step to keep our balance, and then set another peg to hold the ground we had not lost. At night, when my back remembered the stocks, and my pride remembered that it had friends, I laid out my tools as I had learned to do when sleep wanted proof of tomorrow. Hammer Plain adds. Next to them on the bench, the chest sat under the weight of a coil of rope and a hoop driver, solidarity pretending to be clutter. The village breathed. Cats resumed their study of indifference. The willow house, empty for the moment, stood with its door ajar as if ready to receive pain and give it a place to sit. We were not winning, we were not losing. We were holding a craft in its way more exacting than either. News does not arrive on horseback so much as it arrives on faces. The first face carried dust and a grin too large to be only his. A drover from the south came into our square with a gait that could not decide between hurry and triumph. He asked for water, took 2 deep swallows, as if paying a debt, and said, "They are walking to the city." He did not have to say which city. He meant the one that keeps the crown and the mint and the habit of telling the rest of us what our days are worth. We made the drover sit, which is how you honour a messenger, without making a shrine of him, Margot asked. Everyone with a back that has been rented too long, he said. Men from the marsh and the Weald boys who were tired of being lads' women with kerchiefs tight as oaths. Banners made from bedsheets. Words that do not apologize for being loud. The priest reached for the rope he sometimes carries, when reason needs something to hold. And what do they want? He asked. Not as interrogation, but as inventory. To be reckoned with, said the drover, and then more carefully to be free to sell their days to whoever pays as if days were worth keeping. He looked at our bowl, our chalk square, and noticed about quality, as you have done here, but in a voice big enough for walls to hear. More faces brought more pieces. A tinker who had seen a levy of men refusing to pay a tax that snarled at their daughters' names. A carter who had watched a gate open because it feared to be closed by force. A tailor who described with professional admiration a crowd that fit itself through a street like a perfect seam. The stories braided into one rope that looked strong enough to pull something heavy out of the mud. For a day we worked with the odd energy generated by other people's courage. Hammers found a higher note. The forge sang as if iron had waited years for a chorus. The chest under the bench acquired a dignity we had not granted it before. If the city listens, Thomas said, wiping his brow with the part of his sleeve not yet married to soot, then the law will have to learn arithmetic again. We should send something, Aline said, practical, even in hope. Bread travels better than speeches. By evening, we had filled 2 baskets with loaves, cheese, and a small pouch of the scrivener's excellent ink gifts for strangers we might need to call neighbours. The cloth sellers contributed a length of blue to tie around each basket's handle, so they can recognise our intent from far off, one said. Intent like colour carries. At dawn, the second messenger came a boy with knees that had met every ditch between us and the main road. He wanted to be older than he was. He had acquired dust as if it were experience. They were heard, he blurted without preface. The great house opened its doors. Words were said that sounded like a promise. Men threw their caps in the air and did not apologise when they failed to catch them. The square let out a breath that had been holding us like a corset. Old Lou leaned on his stick and chuckled a private chuckle, the kind he saves for days when stories think they might turn into truths. We went about our tasks lighter, not foolishly, but as if gravity had agreed to be civil. Even the posted statute looked less imperial, more like a piece of paper experimenting with humility. The priest did not sermonize. He mended a child's torn cuff and said, "Let us be glad in a way that does not break." Joy stayed one night. In the morning, the boy returned with a second report that arrived like a stone through a window. He did not sit. He stood in the same place, and his mouth learned how to refuse sweetness. There was a meeting in a field, he said. A crowd and a few men who carry the world like it is their inheritance, and the leader of the walkers, he was cut down in the midst of them. He swallowed the next words, and then made them anyway. They scattered. I saw a man's hat in the mud, with no head near it. I saw a boy my size, with his hands lifted, as if holding a bowl for mercy. He looked at our bowl, and began to cry in the peculiar way where the body does not move and only the eyes do the work. No one rushed to contradict. There are moments when argument would be vandalism. Margot set her palm on the boy's shoulder, not to still him, but to keep the square from feeling as though it had left him alone in it. The priest closed his eyes and opened them again, like a man trying a door that he knows is locked but must test for form's sake. Old Lou sat down very carefully, the way you set a heavy pot where the table can take it. I should have known, said Thomas, which is what hopeful men say as if they were volunteers in their own disappointment. Hope is not a mistake, Aline said, eyes hot enough to heat iron. A promise broken is not an argument against promises. She put the bread baskets aside and fetched the smallest of the chairs we kept for those days when bodies needed to surrender politely. The boy sat the blue ribbon dangling and looking torn without having been torn. The law moved like weather after lightning irregular searching, eager to make itself felt. Riders returned to villages along the road and carried back a tribute of names. Stocks and cells did the petty work of teaching knees to be obedient. Fines sprouted like fungus after rain. A gallows was erected in a town not far from ours, and painted restraint in the colour of warning. We did not go to the gallows. We adopted a program of stubborn care. The chest opened and closed with the rhythm of a bellows-out flowed coin-bred salve, in flowed coin. From those who had extra time, from those who had hours, a pair of shirts from the tailor, who had stitched through the worst years and refused to let cloth become an accomplice. The priest walked not with sermon, but with shoe leather, to places where a word spoken in an ordinary tone could keep an ordinary hurt from growing into a story that needed walls. We updated our notices. Beneath quality is a speed no law can catch. We wrote in smaller script, courage has quiet versions. Beside the basin at the cooper's shed, someone chalked, Rin's hands share fines. The writing made us smile not because the jokes were good, they were not, but because handwriting is proof that a hand is steady. Work continued. The city had its smoke and its orders. We had beams that would fall if unaddressed. We did not pretend that mending a roof was resistance, but we refused to act as if capitulation could be dolled up as prudence. We arranged our days in ways that kept the statute busy, chasing our shadows. Rates were concealed in loaves and measured in extra care. Meetings were not held. Tasks were simply done by the same people at the same time, in a pattern a blind man could trace. We taught ourselves the art of the caveat. I can help if the timber arrives by noon, which meant pay me the way a noon deserves, and we will make nails if hinges do not starve, which meant don't buy ornament with bread's money. Night fell earlier, as if caution had dimmed the wick. On an evening that smelled of wet wool and leaves rubbed raw, we gathered in the tavern not to plot, but to remember how to breathe around each other. The air still had ashes in it from a city we could not see, and yet we laughed, not at the ruined, not at the rulers, but at a joke about cats, with good union rules. Laughter is a lubrication. It prevents the machinery of grief from seizing. Will it come right? The boy asked, finally his eyes having finished their necessary work. Not by itself, the priest said. He had taken off his collar and looked like a man who had dug more than he had prayed. But the road that turns is made of feet, and we have those. Meanwhile he lifted his cup. We keep each other from falling into holes. Old Lou scraped foam from his lip and said, the city wanted a chorus and got a choir that forgot its hymn. That happens. The throat will find the tune again. It sounded like comfort because it did not pretend to be prophecy. We sent the bread anyway, not to the palace or the square, where men had made unkillable gestures, but to the edges, to women who sat outside a jail with a bundle and a worry to boys, who had walked home with blisters full of news and no idea where to put it, to tanners, and smiths, whose work had been interrupted by the excitement of other people's words. We tied the blue ribbon around each bundle and wrote nothing on a tag, because hunger can recognize itself without a label. Later, when the riders grew bored of being stern, and the parchment on our lintel became a rain-gnawed moth of a thing, we pulled it down and used the dry corner to light a fire. No one cheered. We made soup. The city would keep its towers and its habits. We would keep our benches pulled into the light, our chest, under the weight of work. Our basin by the door, our habit of placing chairs where unusual days might require them. If the great houses ever asked what we had learned, we might have told them that promises are architecture, and when yours fell, we used ours to keep the weather out. The next morning, I laid my tools in their usual order and felt under the hammer's familiar nick the thin pulse of an undramatic vow to refuse panic, its favourite costume, grandness, and to dress courage as we always had, in aprons and rope, the clean click of a latch meeting a door that means to hold. The first proper snow came like a courtesy, not a conquest, soft, considerate, piling itself in places that made roofs look competent and lanes briefly honest. We had agreed without speeches that this would be the year we tried a feast. Not to taunt hunger. Hunger has a long memory, but to teach it manners. Modest Margot said when anyone tried to gild the idea. Enough to remember we belonged to one table. We set the longboards in the cooper's shed, because work sheds are where our village believes its better self. The forge offered a trestle that had pretended to be a door once. The granary loaned a bench that had opinions about weight. Children swept sawdust into corners with a seriousness that made the corners feel promoted. Thomas hung a lantern where it would persuade gloom to mind its tone. The priest brought a clean cloth, not white felt like boasting, but pale enough to admit the candlelight. Food arrived the way, favour should unannounced, measured by capacity, not pride. A ham with the humility of long curing. 2 loaves that had risen like good tempers. Onions surrendering their sharpness to butter. A dish of roots that tasted of patience. From the cloth sellers a wedge of a foreign cheese with a rind that looked as if it had learned to read maps. Eileen set a pot on the brazier and coaxed steam from broth the colour of resilience. Someone slid in a jar of pickled cabbage, labelled in a hand that had only recently made peace with letters. Old Lou deposited a handful of dried apples, like small, well-travelled coins. Cats patrolled the perimeter with a professionalism that discouraged mice and grand speeches. We arranged ourselves without arguing the algebra of class. The steward's wife came and sat beside the woman who scrubs the church steps. They discussed soap with a candour that would have improved kingdoms. The priest chose the end of the table where drafts test resolve. He said grace short and then put his mouth to better work. The boy who had carried news of the city's hope and breaking sat in the middle where laughter could find him quickly. Thomas took the place nearest the brazier, because tending fire is what his hands do when no one is looking. I sat opposite Margot, so that if any chair began to wobble, one of us could catch it. We did not toast victory, we toasted continuance. To roofs that held, said Thomas, touching cup to cup with the carefulness you reserve for the first of anything. To rates spoken aloud, said Aline, and her voice made the ads on the wall feel attentive. To the willow house and what it let us keep, said the priest in his eyes, did a small pilgrimage around the faces to note who wasn't there and make room for them anyhow. Old Lou raised his cup and said, to the cats which allowed the room to laugh and permitted grief to sit down among us without darkening the soup. We ate. Eating done together is a kind of choir. Spoons kept time. The ham yielded in good order. The foreign cheese made a case for distance being instructive. We let it win. Children threaded between knees like small necessary messengers, delivering slices and rumours about sledding prospects. Someone produced a fist-sized orange from a traveller's pack, the skin shining like a joke about summer. We passed it around so every palm could borrow its scent. When the edge of appetite softened and speech regained its elbows, the talk turned to inventory, the kind you can make without a slate. What had been reborn, the ropewalks song which now appeared in spinning and in scrubbing, and sometimes in the long part of weeping. The basin by the door, no longer a novelty, but a habit with seniority. The way a question asked early saves wood and tempers, the permission women took and men learned to give, without acting, as if generosity were a coin they had minted. What had not returned the certainty that another's suffering is a distant storm, the habit of blaming the convenient villain, the lazy comfort of obedience. The steward's wife surprised herself by telling a true thing in the voice usually reserved for market arithmetic. When the statute came, she said, I told myself it was for order. Then I watched my cook count the coins she would not have, and order looked different. She stared at her hands as if they had issued the statement without her. I have been trying to make better soup since. No one applauded applause is a poor gardener of fragile growth. But Margot passed her the salt, as if conferring a small, precise honour. The priest said nothing, which is sometimes the holiest thing a man of words can manage. We remembered our dead without unfurling a litany. Each of us placed on the table by the elbow some token of those who would have sat with us, a spoon kept for a father, a scrap of kerchief, a nail-hammered square by a boy who had taught himself the art of straightness and then taught it to the grave, a twig from the hedgerow where someone dear had liked to stand and reassign names to clouds. We did not speak the names aloud, because grief eats less when not fed with ceremony. But the tokens made a second table along the board's edge, and the candlelight read their faces as if to memorize them. After the bowls were cleared, and the last slice of bread had become a lesson in fair division, we tried a game that is older than law, telling what the year had taught us that we had not consented to learn. That structures are only as just as the hands that maintain them, said Aline, cleaning her hammer's handle with a scrap of linen. That patience can be a tactic and not a surrender, said Thomas. That rumour is a draught under a door you can fix with a rag and habit, said the scrivener, who had recently become a connoisseur of rags and habits. That God requires less explanation than help, said the priest, and then looked embarrassed to have said it so plainly. My offering came out like a carpentry note. That mercy is a form of accuracy, I said. You fit people to the day they can carry, not the one you wish existed. Margot gave me a look that said she understood the joinery and was willing to sign off on it. When we were done, we sorted the leftovers with the same care we had given the feast. Portions went to 2 houses where illness had taken the appetite's chair at the table. A heel of bread and the rind of the map-reading cheese were wrapped for the night watchman at the far gate, who keeps foxes from applying for citizenship. A bowl of broth travelled to the Willow house, because buildings also remember kindness. The chest under the bench received 3 coins, and a button the latter deposited by a child who had decided savings should have more interesting shapes. Outside, the snow continued its competent work. We stepped into it and found the lane briefly democratized, all footsteps equal when the world is new. People walked home in 2s and 3s, carrying bowls and small plans. Cats wrote their indecipherable alphabets across thresholds. The forge sighed itself dark. The lantern over the shed door made a modest vow to last until the last to leave could see the latch. I stayed to bank the brazier and put my hand on the bench the way one does when saying goodnight to a room that has behaved. In the damp glow I could read a future that did not promise to be easy, only legible. More bargaining, more careful defiance, more small inventions dressed as manners. The feast had not changed the law, or lifted a tax, or convinced a city of anything. It had changed us into a shape we could recognize again, people who sit, pass, listen, mend, and expect tomorrow enough to wash a basin tonight. Before I left, I moved the chest back under the bench and set on it a coil of rope, a hoop driver, and the spoon I keep for memory. Work would sit there in the morning and keep the chest from dreaming beyond its station. Snow ticked at the sill. The village breathed out together the way a table does after everyone stands wood-adjusting nails, holding the structure content with its burdens because they have been distributed by hands that know them. By the time winter finished writing its name on the window and left the village to its thaw, we had learned to live in a grammar that didn't exist before. We had not rebuilt a world, so much as relearned how to hold 1-cup basin rope, rate spoken aloud, chair placed where an unusual day might need it. The chalk cross on a door was no longer a threat, but a sentence that told the truth kindly. The Willow house stood with its blankets folded, not as a monument to fear, but as the village's promise to remember what it had already learned. Cats moved through doorways like punctuation keeping the text clear of small errors. We kept our notices, posted in head and habit. Quality is a speed no law can catch. Let us be careful of words. Courage has quiet versions. They were not slogans, so much as joinery rules, reminders that wood swells with weather and people do too, and that allowances are not indulgences, but the mathematics of endurance. We became deft with small accuracies, a nail driven true, a hinge pinned to outlast a storm, a question asked before misunderstanding had time to harden. If you had walked with us along the lane after the feast, when snow made justice with its equal prints, you might have thought the lesson was modest. It was. Modesty is what keeps lessons usable. We did not declare victory over plague or decree righteousness into law. We placed a basin by the door and kept it there. We rewrote the price of a day's work on our tongues and practiced saying it until the words no longer sounded like disobedience. We learned to push back without breaking what we still needed to lean on. We learned to pass bread without inventorying favours. We learned that rumour is a draft under a door and the cure is a rag, a habit, and someone kind enough to tuck both into the crack. Our chest stayed under the bench weighted with a coil of rope and the expectation that work will sit on it tomorrow. Coins went out of it and back into it as if the village were teaching money a better religion. Fines did not stop, they sulked less effectively. The statute did not soften. It learned to go around us when we turned sideways and became too many angles to catch. We did not become saints, we became good at ordinary. After catastrophe, ordinary is a genius. What remains? The mill wheel, turning with the polite throat-clearing noise of continuity. The forge where iron recites its proofs. The cooper's shed where circles are argued into straight staves and win. The rope walk where patience braids itself into strength you can trust to a well. Children who can sign their names on a sack and then blow the flower letters away because tomorrow's lesson needs room. A priest who has discovered that help makes better sermons than certainty. A steward's wife who is learning soup like a language. Women whose hammers fall straight not delicately, but beautifully. Men who listen because roofs and people both demand it. And grief seated properly, not banished. We kept a second table along the edge of the first spoons, for those who no longer lift them. A scrap of kerchief, a nail, a twig from the hedgerow. Candlelight read their faces and found us keeping our end of the promise to continue. If there is a shape to our vow, it is undramatic. Rinse, mark, mend, ask, listen, share, teach, check, rest, repeat. It looks small until you measure it against a century. Then you realize it is architecture. Thanks for listening. If this slow, careful walk through medieval peasant's life and medieval survival gave you something steady to hold, you can help us keep building. Like this episode, so the algorithm doesn't forget small stories with long echoes. Subscribe to Poor Historian for more candlelit journeys where history whispers but still tells the truth. Turn on the bell so the next chapter finds you even on busy days. Comment below. Which habit from the village would you adopt today? Basin by the door rates, spoken aloud, the willow house, the chest under the bench, or courtesy for strange days? What should we explore next? Food preservation without cold, the real economics of a thatched roof, midwives, and quiet medicine, or the long tale of the 1381 uprising. Share this video with someone who loves careful craft and slow endurance more than fireworks. Want more in this vein? Check our playlists. Medieval Peasant's Life, Daily Work Prices, Tools, and the Strange Dignity of Enough. Medieval Survival, Practical Resilience from Plague Years to Lean Winters. If you'd like to support the work more directly, consider becoming a channel member or joining our Patreon. It helps us commission art, dig through boring but vital sources, and keep every script as accurate as a well-set hinge. Until next time, keep a basin by the door, a chair for strange days, and a small chest under the bench, because tomorrow is just another piece of joinery, and we build it the same way. We survive together patiently, accurately.